as an athlete, I don't think that we understand how well we're trained and how we can pick up something and learn quickly, how we can see the vision, we can see our opponents, we can see their weaknesses, we can take advantage of those weaknesses, we can take advantage of our strengths. We know our whole team lineup. We know every position that our teammates are supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to contribute to the overall mission of the vision. And since I have continued to evolve, and I guess I'm continuing to evolve, one thing I've noticed is I still don't know where I'm at yet. And I feel like that's very similar maybe for a lot of athletes, because we're all wanting to help with change. We want to lead change. We want to start change. We see the system's broken. The system in healthcare it's horrifying. And hopefully, by doing all the stuff that we're doing right now with Revitalist, it's going to help lead the way. So, not only did I play Division I, I became a nurse, became an anesthesia provider, now I'm a psychiatry provider. And then I found it was a great idea to also become the CEO of a public company. So now Revitalist, which is the company I created, is on 3 securities exchanges, Canada, United States, and European. So now I'm the CEO of a public company, right? And I get to learn to talk about stock. So there's something about athletes, and I used to say it was because I was a CRNA, and I don't know if you know what those are. That's a certified registered nurse anesthetist, and they're very strong people too, very strong. You don't want to mess with them. They're not very nice people sometimes either. They're very confident, very empowered. So when I opened this company, and we have 9 locations across 6 states now, right? And we want to have a lot more. But I thought, it's because they're CRNAs as to why they can be so strong to lead this. But over the past year, I've slowly started evolving, thinking, maybe it's the training I received as an athlete growing up. Because there's people who just can't see it. You give them something and they take it and they don't know what to do with it. And with evolving of this is a brand new pathway. With the evolution of all of this, you've got to have people who are willing to pivot and shift and be flexible and notice the weaknesses of their teammates. I've also slightly insulted people when I tell them that they do have weaknesses. People in the civilian world don't really like to hear that. I see that as constructive criticism, so I've had to learn to speak differently. But what I've learned since sitting at this conference is you guys are all influencers. And psychedelics, like it or not, if it's a good word or if it's a bad word, to me about a year ago is a bad word, they're going to change the way that we look at healthcare. They're going to change the way that we look at the brain. They are changing the way that we look at the brain. They're going to change the way that we look at mental health, at pain, the way that your cardiac function is, your neurologic function, your neurodegenerative diseases. A lot of football players in here, what people love. Something in healthcare tells us that we should scare people. So we like to tell people, well, you might have something called CTE, which is your chronic traumatic encephalopathy from the repetitive blows to your head. But we're not sure when it's going to present itself because we can't diagnose it technically until you're post-mortem. So we'll diagnose it after you die, but we don't really know what to do with it. The neat thing with psychedelics is it's actually showing that it's dissolving the plaques in the brain. And they're using these with rodents, right? So all this science, this is the cool thing. People are like, why haven't I heard about ketamine in this capacity? Why haven't I learned about psychedelics in this capacity? And it's because pharmaceutical companies can't own ketamine. It's too old. It's been around since 1970. When pharmaceutical companies actually develop drugs, they own the royalties for 20 years. Ketamine's too old. It is the accidental godfather of the psychedelic space. So Yale University, back in the late 1990s, they were trying to make rodents schizophrenic. They gave them tons of ketamine, and they recognized little guys were actually becoming less depressed. So that took off. So now there's actually scans, right? So in medicine, it's interesting. Behavioral is much more theoretical. Medicines, we're much more evidence-based, and we don't like each other, right? We're completely siloed. The interesting part is medicine now believes in mental health because we can put it on paper. We have MRIs, we have PET scans, we have changes in your labs. Just after one ketamine infusion, you get to see all this stuff. And then the neat thing, too, is we've learned the brain is not nearly as eclectic as we thought it was. It's very complex, and it's a pattern, and it duplicates itself. So I've been involved in maybe 10,000 ketamine infusions, never had ketamine, zero desire. I like control. But people who I've sat with, I still do consults, I still do providing stuff sometimes, try not to because I have the inability to say no sometimes, but basically the people, when I sit with them, they said, how did you know this was gonna happen? How did you know, like, are you a wizard? You know, it's no, it's the same way. The brain follows a very similar pattern as any other organ in our body, right? So why would the brain be so eclectic and not anything else? And for some reason, we put it off in this little tiny isolated island. So what ketamine does, from what I can tell, is it reverses the way the brain acts. So your brain doesn't know right from wrong, good from bad. We think it does, but it doesn't. It duplicates what it knows. Our brain is meant for survival. Ketamine and psychedelics, they disassociate. And what does that mean? They disconnect the objective from the subjective. They disconnect your physical presence with the emotion that's being felt at the same time. So what I like to tell a lot of people is, how do you know if you're struggling with your mental health? Right? Everybody's like, oh, I don't know. I don't want to go to a psychiatrist. And shoot, I wouldn't go to one either. I did my psych school, and I felt like I was just pushing through the pharmaceutical book, right, of just prescribing oral drugs that don't work. And when I say that, I mean, some people, yes, take antidepressants, SSRIs or SNRIs. There's 4 primary classes, basically, of. Take them if they're working for you. If they're not working for you, there's so much more hope out there. So the reason I talk about a lot of these things is because, 1, I'm super passionate about it. 2, I've seen the miraculous pieces of it. And 3, I don't want anybody to mess it up. So you get to see my face a lot, especially being the CEO of a public company. And actually the stocks are horrible right now. So investors like to yell at me over that too. But you know, certain things you can control versus not control. But with psychedelics, I don't know if you all saw, there was an article in the Rolling Stones a couple weeks ago. There's an NHL player named Riley Cody. And Riley was actually talking about going to a retreat in Jamaica and doing psychedelics there. Psychedelics in the United States right now are well, unless you're an organ and they're decriminalized, they're still not accepted. You still can't prescribe them as a medical or behavioral provider. They're working towards that way, but there's going to be lots of legislation, lots of politics, lots of people who really think they know what they're talking about, and they've been out of the field for about 25 years, and they're just really a big voice. So what athletes need to do, if you guys are looking to be influencers or leaders, you all need to start looking into the psychedelic world. Johns Hopkins has actually been researching psychedelics for over 20 years now. You've got Oxford University, you've got Yale University, you have the National Institutes of Mental Health, all these people. And the reason you don't hear about it is because it's not owned by pharmaceutical companies yet. They don't have the money to put into it. It's usually about $100 million to actually patent a drug. So they're in the process of doing all those things right now. But unless you know where to go to look for it, it's non-existent. And physicians don't know about it. Prescribers don't know about it. And the only way they're going to know about it is constant awareness and advocacy. So I actually did create a American Association of Psychedelics. We're having our first conference in Knoxville this year. And it's really to start training people to make sure the quality's there. So we do have athletes coming. If you're an athlete and you want to speak about mental health or whatever else, we can do all that too. So sorry, that was my intro. I know it was long. I'm long-winded. But basically, I'm just going to go through these just a little bit. And then that way you guys can kind of hear specifically what we're talking about. But this is all kind of a loaded question. I've been called the disruptor in the healthcare, which I thought was an insult initially, but I've learned that it's actually a compliment. I've had insurance companies call me a weapon, which is great, you know, but these are all like cool things like if you're an athlete, right? But when you're in the civilian world, especially being a female, and a nurse, which nurses are also looked down upon. I've been told I have no idea what I'm doing a lot, you know, but then when I go and actually start asking questions to the people who told me I didn't know what I was doing, clearly they fall off because I do know the research behind it. I'm a subject matter expert, actually, with ketamine, and I review articles before they go out for continuing education credits. But basically with athletes, here's the thing. You've all been trained differently than the civilian world. You've been taught to be leaders. You've been taught to create structure and organize chaos. So every play that you had, that you may have lost, or something happened in the previous play, you've had to update it and update it and update it. And then at any time, you lose or you win the game. You lose the game, you go get better. You win the game, great job. Make sure that your strengths stay there. But what people don't see is they don't see that athletes are their own breed. And that's something that we focus on with Revitalist. We actually have we look at underserved populations, and my underserved populations that I like to focus on are athletes, veterans, first responders, and adolescents, because people can't speak to them. They're scared to death of them. And I've had therapists who actually, Derek Furlow was in the athletic certification that we did, who was trying to tell me the reason I got ejected out of like 13 games in high school between softball and basketball was because I had childhood anxiety. And I was like, no, it's not childhood anxiety. I had the drive to win, and I didn't know how to pull it back, and it didn't matter what got in my way. So fortunately, this company became a sport. But as you all evolve in life with your careers, you're going to continue to use those skills that you've been trained because it's all you know. And people are going to tell you, you don't know what you're doing, or why are you doing this, or how are you doing this, or how are you shifting? You've got too much stuff on your plate. You've got all these things, and you're like, I don't know, maybe there is something wrong with me. No, there's not. It's the way you've been trained. So you always have to have a frame of reference. But I was telling Candy, who's my executive officer, she probably gets a gold star because she keeps up with me. But I was telling her, since sitting here, I have felt more connected with myself hearing other athletes speak. I don't think I've ever been to an athletic conference. Been to neurologic, psychiatric, medical, therapy, all those, but I've never been to one of these. So the two biggest bodies in the country, probably in the world, veterans and athletes, two of the biggest underserved people or communities in the country as well, and in the world more than likely. So basically with this piece, the problem is athletes, nobody really looks at our mental health until we're struggling so bad we don't really know what's going on. Then nobody knows how to deal with us because we've been trained to function and, not choke and all this other stuff. So we're almost at the end of the road before we can ask for help. So are athletes a high-risk population? Yes, they are a high-risk population because they don't know when to say, hey, coach, I think something might be wrong. So one thing that we've noticed, we actually talked to a lot of universities, team sports are actually much healthier than individual sports because the team sports, they'll go to each other. The individual sports, they feel isolated. So you're seeing tons of homicidality. You're seeing a ton of suicidality. One of the universities we spoke with, I think they have about 800 student athletes. They have one of the athletes actually inpatient and mental health every other week. And they don't know what to do about it because the universities won't give them therapists. But then when they do give them, we have a therapy program. Their therapy program is like an employee assistance program that has no idea how to speak to athletes. So one thing we created was virtual coaching that we can offer across the country to where the therapists are actually trained with the athletic certification to where they understand how to speak to athletes because you got to get help, when you need it. So one thing I've noticed with the athletes, it's when you start feeling off base. You feel like you're core. You feel like you can't calm yourself down. You can't drop a thought. You ruminate all the time. So the neat thing about rumination, if you know what rumination is, it's where thoughts continuously loop, and you can't break them. You can't drop it. So when you tell people, you're like, just drop it, and they're getting annoying, they physically may not have the capability of dropping something. So they've proved something in your brain called the salience network. And the salience network is every time you break a rumination, your salience network gets stronger. So what I like to tell people is if you feel like you can't categorize and you can't prioritize your thoughts, you need help. And that's when people go, I don't know, they were fine one day and the next day they had a nervous breakdown. I don't know what happened. And you'll see when people come and speak to you or when they do a consult, you'll be talking to them and you can tell they're just like, they're done. They're like, a little frozen possum. And you're just like, did you hear anything I said? No. But then they'll look at their person sitting next to him and go, but did you hear what they said? So that person feels completely out of control and frozen, and they're trying to put their control onto somebody else because they feel like they can't lead anymore. They've lost their own leadership abilities. And psychiatry actually does believe that to a point, but they just like to, usually give you all kinds of medicines. So one thing here, drug abuse, ketamine. You hear that coincide. You'll hear ketamine's a horse tranquilizer, cat Valium, Special K, date rape, all kinds of fun stuff. The thing with ketamine, it's been around since 1970. It's FDA approved. First utilized on the, not the VA, Vietnam, on the war field. That's actually where they used ketamine initially. So anything that's been around long enough is going to get abused. Fortunately, our society is so archaic. When someone actually dies from any other medication that's not a scheduled drug, they don't count it as an overdose. So SSRI, all your antidepressants right now, people are dying from them. They're overdosing on them. It's not even getting in the books because it's not a scheduled drug. So everything is off. Like, it's so skewed. But basically what I've learned with drug abuse and psychedelics, there's actually a beautiful study that just came out of the Journal of Psychiatry talking about how ketamine is addressing chronic alcoholism. People who relapse when they're getting treatment right now, they're relapsing about 85% of the time. And in the United States, we don't keep up with how efficacious the systems are. We just let people come back every 30 days. So the ketamine study that just came out showed that people were actually relapsing about 26% of the time, 6 months out. So, it's like 300% increase in improvement. So, and then when you hear people who, like, we're on social media, and people on social media are not always nice, but people who say, oh, this is going to create an opioid addiction, this is going to create all this. Any drug that you take can be used as a crutch. Anything you take can be used as a crutch. Shopping, sex, drugs, anything. The thing with ketamine is it's actually directly addressing the part of our brain that's causing the addiction in the first place. So there's something called your default mode network. Your default mode network gets off. If you ever talk to people who've been on drugs, I have. I grew up in East Tennessee. I grew up in a rural area with a lot of drugs. People who are trying to get sober, they don't understand why when they go take a drug, they take the drug, it makes them feel good, but then they feel horrible about it. Your default mode network is, we're supposed to have a positive action and positive reward, and a negative action and a negative reward. What actually happens with people with addiction is, it's a negative action that causes a positive reward. And ketamine actually addresses that it directly addresses that. People have been very angry at me when I've been so happy for them, because they'll come to me with depression or whatever else, and they'll say, this one lady, she was highly angry. She smoked 2 packs a day for 40 years. Came to me for depression. Depression's doing great. Every time she goes to smoke a cigarette, she throws up. And she was angry because she did not want to stop smoking. But what it did is it made a negative action to negative reward. Same thing with meth, cocaine, all those guys. There's another drug out there called antabuse. It's not a bad drug, but it can torture some people. But ketamine's actually switching that back to where people don't feel emotionally connected to the drug anymore. And where you're an athlete, people don't know how to speak to you, then you start medicating yourself, right? Uppers, downers. Everybody likes to say uppers and downers. Anxiety, depression. You take uppers and downers to get you up in the morning, to put you to sleep at night. Some people do coffee in the morning. I do. I do it all day long. But with your uppers and downers, that's what they do with you in the doctor's office. When you go in, you say, I have depression. They're like, yeah, you probably have anxiety too. So I'm actually going to give you SSRI and a benzodiazepine. So they're giving you uppers and downers right there. Or they're going to give you Adderall. Give an athlete Adderall, we feel like we can conquer the world. Because we're trained, and then we're also medicating ourselves as well. So one thing you have to be very careful about being an athlete and being trained to the capacity you've been trained, you're at high risk for drug abuse. You're at high risk for addiction, period, end discussion. Nobody understands you, but emotionally, you'll get connected to that drug. And then what? Then it's actually ingrained in your brain. You don't know how to stop it because nobody knows how to talk to you. So with these pieces, there's mental health, there's physical health. Mental health and pain coexist. It's directly related. It's not if I break my foot, that's normal pain, right? Or if you actually have an anatomical issue with pain. What happens with neurologic pain, which is what ketamine and psychedelics address, is your injury healed, but you're still hurting. Or I broke my wrist, but now my whole arm hurts. So one thing that we've noticed with pain when it's neurologic speaking, and the brain's not really been addressed effectively, is it will start going up your big joints basically initially, right? So it'll start like, if you break your left wrist and it's not really affected, or you fix the injury, but the pain's still there, then your pain's gonna go to your elbow, then it'll go to your shoulder, and it either stays unilaterally or it crosses over. So it may go left wrist to right wrist, left elbow to right elbow. And it's so funny. Like as anesthesia, I'm a pain expert, but we have no idea about this in anesthesia. But I'll ask people, I'm like, does your pain do this and this and this and this? And they're like, yes, how did you know? I'm like, oh. It's amazing. The brain follows patterns that nobody else knows about because they're unwilling to listen. So it's hard, and that's why people have to be their own advocates. That's why I created Revitalist 2, was to help bring consistency to the outpatient space, because I thought therapists are supposed to like hug you and tell you you're a great person and push you along your way. And I've learned that you can go to 40 different therapists and get 40 different pieces of information because they're not evidence-based, they're theory-based, and they like to take their own individual perception of something and then put their own twist on it. Which, when I did cardiac anesthesia with heart surgery, please God, don't do that with heart surgery. I would prefer to go to Maine or California and then follow standard of care. So that's what we are trying to create here in the outpatient world. And it's interesting because everyone's territorial too in the outpatient space. So they don't like to talk to each other. Like, it's amazing. So fortunately, the more athletes and influencers we can get involved with this mission, the more wave you guys are going to do, because pharmaceutical companies, I think Medicare is going to approve psychedelics in 2024. There's an FDA program where they've been testing psychedelics since 1985. This is nothing new. Everybody's like, oh, you've been doing ketamine. I'm like, yeah, it's only been around since 1970. They're like, oh, it's brand new, it's investigational. But fortunately, in the anesthesia world, we give it to C-sections and babies and moms and autistic children and neuro cases and all these things. So our society is so skewed, but it's got to have people who are willing to lead. And that's the neat thing with you all, and hearing all this stuff this week, or this weekend, is there's people out there who aren't afraid. And one thing I've noticed, doing everything that I'm doing, people are scared to death to do anything new. They're afraid of repercussions, they're afraid of retaliations, they're afraid of going to prison, they're afraid of breaking the law. And I'm like, do you understand what breaking the law means? It doesn't mean you're going to mess up the first time. It means that you're doing repetitive behaviors that you know are illegal. That's breaking the law. Take a chance. Try to save a life. The youngest kid we've treated was 12 years old. She had coexisting homicidality, suicidality. She was out of school. She actually got back in school. The oldest person we've treated was 90. Lost her husband after they were married for 72 years, and she had complex grief. So it's amazing. I mean, it's so cool. But are there ketamine places out there that aren't great? Yes. So know your research with that. You can always compare them to us, or you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to break down the granulation aspects of it. But with all of these pieces here, talking about ketamine, psychedelics, looking at mental health treatment, you've got to figure out what mental health treatment works best for you and the people that you know. Don't call 911 and go to the ER every time. That's what we like to tell you in the medical world right now, right? We don't like to talk about it, but call 911, go to the ER. Or actually, there's a new number that came out called 988, and I hope it works. I think it went live today. So hopefully that will help people to get a little bit more understanding and education. But in medical world, we've told each other we don't know anything about mental health, and we've siloed it. And then fortunately, with the company we've created, we have medical providers, behavioral providers, therapists. That's been exhausting. It's like having Russian, Chinese, and English people try to talk to each other when really they have no idea what each other's saying. But they're all working on the same thing. So these are just quotes. So I encourage all of you all to be open-minded to this, to recognize there's going to be a lot of money in the psychedelic space. There's going to be a lot of people getting into it for the wrong reasons. There should be a lot of people getting into it for the right reasons. So if you guys want jobs, if you want to be influencers, all this other stuff, one, we've got the conference coming up in November, but there's a lot of psychedelic conferences. Mike Tyson actually spoke at one that we went to last fall called Microdose in Miami. So, there's people who are trying as hard as they can to actually advocate for this space. Let me see how much time. 3 minutes. So, ketamine infusions. There's oral ketamine, there's IM ketamine, it's a shot, there's infusions. The infusions are where all your evidence-based data is. So people who want to get ketamine, I always encourage them to do the infusions because we're still looking at everything, even though we've been looking at it for over 20 years. Do I think it will go to the oral route? It might, I don't know. But there's a lot of companies that are sending ketamine home. And again, when you're struggling, if you get a substance that helps you to disassociate and takes you away from the environment that you don't like, what's that going to do? Possibly create addiction. So with Revitalist, we have our ketamine sports program. We focus on athletes. We have athletic advisory. But then we also have an athletic certification. It's a 2-day certification to where you have myself, Derek Furlow, Candy Olant, who was actually an elementary school teacher, Alexis, you're under the light, Alexis Hornbuckle, who also played the WNBA. We're all, trained in the athletic certification. So we made that so athletes can feel heard. Because, unfortunately, there's been a lot of suicides of females as of late in the collegiate space. And then there's people who are canceling their entire seasons because of it. And what does that do? That creates a cascade effect. So anytime you lose anyone to suicide, everyone around in that immediate vicinity has a 40% chance of killing themselves too. So it's not that it's, don't talk about it, they'll go kill themselves. No, talk about it so we can understand it more. Being an athlete, I really encourage you all to start having more self-introspection. Try to understand yourself more. It's not scary. Your brain actually has the pattern of redundancy. If you can recognize your own pattern, it won't keep duplicating itself because your brain's just looking for clarity. So the more self-introspection that you have, the higher level of emotional intelligence you have, the more awareness you have about yourself, then the more you can stay healthy. So is mental health out of our control? No, it's not. Is there a genetic factor? Probably. But is there a genetic factor that increases your risk? Yes. But is there a genetic factor to where psychedelics and ketamine and all that stuff can actually antagonize it and actually improve your life? Yes. So your mental health is much more in control than what you know. So if you've had a lot of hits, post-concussion syndrome, CTEs, all that other stuff, keep looking into ketamine. There's a great video that NBC actually did a few years ago. ESPN's actually coming out with a documentary as well, I think around October, to talk about psychedelics, and they're going to be focusing on athletes. So athletes and veterans are probably going to be two of the biggest people who are going to help influence the space. And you guys have the ability to influence the space. And if there's medical providers who say, you don't know what you're talking about, just call me and I'll come sit with you and we'll talk with them together because they always don't know what they're talking about, or they don't always know what they're talking about, I should say it that way. We do have heart surgeons and neurosurgeons and anesthesia and psychiatry. I have them all with us. I've made a very strong team because it's going to take us all to do it together. So find a safe place. If people want to reach out to Revitalist for virtual coaching, reach out to them. We do it across the country. If you got kids, 12 and up, basically, are the ones that we focus on. Let them know that there's help out there. And, one thing I've learned with teenagers especially, they usually don't want to die. They usually just can't turn their brain off. So for some reason, they like to overdose and hang themselves. But usually after that, if they don't die, that's what they'll tell you, is I just wanted my brain to turn off. So the neat thing is, it's a weakness in your brain, and you can actually work on it to strengthen it. So there's tons of hope out there. So be the team, help teach, empower, align, and mitigate. And then, well, I was going to say, we got 12 things to give away. How about that? If you all want something we got golf balls and T-shirts and all this other stuff because I've ran out of time. But I appreciate you all listening to me. And then keep influencing. Influence the influencers. Thanks, guys.